This presentation will discuss the influence of pole work on equine limb kinematics in trot, providing an understanding of kinematics, an evaluation of pole work and the advantages associated with it, and the influence of pole work on the limb kinematics in trot. Several scientific studies have been critically analysed to support the findings of this presentation. Kinematics is the description of the motion of a body or object and can provide descriptive analysis and quantification of movement. Analysis of movement patterns can tell us whether our horses show early signs of lameness or other locomotive abnormalities that can ultimately lead to injuries and lameness. Ross and Dyson, 2011. Kinematic analysis primarily measures flexion and extension. Back and Clayton, 2013. Kinematics in animals has been studied for a long time and was first studied using chronophotography, which was developed by Muybridge in 1887. However, the modern-day approach uses reflective markers that are placed on the horse's body, and video footage is captured, which is recognised by various software and is able to analyse the kinematics of the horse. Barry, 1999. This presentation focuses on the influence of pole work in equine limb kinematics, specifically in the trot. This is because the trot is a two-beat gait in which the limbs move in diagonal pairs, so consequentially, because of the symmetry of this gait, abnormalities are easiest to identify. Back and Clayton, 2013. Another justification for choosing to focus on limb kinematics in the trot gait is because the current research in this area focuses specifically on the trot. Poles are extremely versatile in terms of use and often support improvement in both the horse and rider. Reed, 2003. Research has identified that pole work has the ability to improve strength, stamina and skill of the horse. Karsten et al. 2017. Poles placed on the ground or raised above the ground are advocated as part of a conditioning program to improve ranges of joint motion and strength of the flexor musculature in the swing phase. Clayton, 1991. The FEI reiterated this in 2019 by stating that when done regularly, pole work can increase your horse's strength and flexibility, improve their ability to engage the hindquarters, and make their paces more expressive and cadenced. This form of regimented exercise requires the horse to develop correct muscle, improve suppleness, and produce impulsion. Karsten et al. 2017. Advantages of pole work. Karsten et al. 2017 completed a study looking into the objectives, principles, and methods of strength training for horses. When discussing types and methods of strength training, it was identified that pole work can be extremely advantageous for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, it can be used as preparation for the young horse before jumping, and due to the forgiving nature of pole work, injuries are extremely rare. It can be used when riding, long reining, or lunging, adding variety to all types of exercise for the horse. Brown et al. 2014 discussed how pole work can be used for therapeutic purposes to restore full ranges of limb joint motion, and that it is highly likely to activate and strengthen the flexor musculature due to the increase in swing phase joint flexions when trotting over poles. Different exercises and pole placement can be utilised to alter limb kinematics, as identified by Wendy Schaefer in her chapter Training the Event Horse. Pole work was used to increase lift and length of the stride in trot. Clayton 2016 then went on to identify that pole work can be useful for core training, as it strengthens the extrinsic forelimb musculature, i.e. extensors and adductors, and it may also recruit the core stabilising musculature. So this leads us to consider what effect pole work might have on the limb kinematics. When thinking about limb kinematics, there are several areas for consideration. The stride is the complete cycle of movement from the contact of a specific foot to the next contact of the same foot. Within the stride, there is the stance and the swing phase. The stance phase is the portion of the stride when the foot is in contact with the ground, and the swing phase is the portion of the stride when the foot is not in contact with the ground. Ferro de Godoy, 2021. The ground reaction force is the force exerted by the ground on a body in contact with it, as per Isaac Newton's third law. Forelimb and hindlimb ground reaction forces must be coordinated to ensure a stable platform of support and to help maintain balance. Clayton et al. 2015. When working the horse, it is best to use exercises that do not increase the ground reaction forces, as this increases stress on the limb and could lead to injury. William, 2020. When the horse is trotting, they move in diagonal pairs. Therefore, when trotting over poles, one diagonal pair of limbs bears the weight, whilst the other pair of diagonal limbs is raised. Brown et al. 2014. This means that there is no exaggerated suspension phase and therefore no required increase in propulsive ground reaction forces. Clayton et al. 2015. The effort required to lift the swing limbs clear of the poles disturbs the horse's balance, which in turn initiates the stance limbs to stabilise the horse and provide balance. Clayton, 2016. It has also been noted that the therapeutic effects of trotting over poles are likely to include improvements in the horse's balance, stability, and precision of movement. Navigating poles in different patterns and at different heights, such as raised and flat, can cause alterations in speed and stride length, but it has been noted to also improve balance and coordination. Ridgway and Harmon, 1999. In more recent research, an increase in stride duration due to an increase in both forelimb and hindlimb swing duration is frequently observed, which is attributable to significant increases in flexion of all joints in the fore and hind limbs, although stride length was not necessarily altered. Doughty, 2019. Clayton et al. 2015 carried out a study measuring stance phase kinematics and ground reaction forces in the forelimbs and hind limbs of horses trotting on level ground and over poles. They found that there was no significant change in the hind limbs in peak vertical ground reaction force when trotting over poles, and no change in the forelimbs. However, the peak vertical ground reaction force did occur significantly later in the stance phase. Transverse ground reaction force did not change significantly in the hind limbs, but showed consistent change in the forelimbs. The forelimb transverse impulse changed from being medially directed on ground level to being laterally directed when trotting over poles, implying that this change from medial to lateral direction may be a mechanism for increasing lateral stability when the gait is perturbed by the increased elevation of the swing limbs. Laterally directed reaction forces occur as a result of tension in the adductor muscles, so it is speculated that pole work is likely to recruit the forelimb adductor musculature, reinforcing that pole work is a suitable method for restoring range of motion and developing muscular strength as part of a rehabilitation program in horses with a symmetrical trot gait. In the same study, they identified that forelimb stance duration did not change, but hindlimb stance was significantly shorter when trotting over poles, and increased stifle and tarsal flexion was noted, which indicates that trot poles do influence limb kinematics, and incorporating trot poles into a rehabilitation program is likely to increase range of motion of all joints of both fore and hind limbs in the swing phase, and that poles contribute towards strengthening the musculature that supports the joints during the stance phase, particularly the forelimb extensor and adductors that help to maintain elevation when trotting over poles. They also identified that trotting over poles is unlikely to cause excessive strain of the soft tissues that support the distal limb. Brown et al. 2014 researched the swing phase kinematics of a horse when trotting over poles. They identified that all joints of both the fore and hind limbs contributed to the increase in hoof height through increased swing phase flexion. Increases in swing phase joint flexions, particularly in the tarsus, metatarsophalangeal joint, and distal interphalangeal joint, were more markedly elevated in the swing phase when poles were present, which would indicate that trotting over poles is effective for activating and strengthening the flexor musculature. Whilst the peak fore hoof height increased, it was also noted that forelimb length decreased significantly when trotting over poles. Currently, evidence only exists to prove that pole work causes immediate changes to limb kinematics. A long-term study to investigate the long-term effects over a 6 to 8 week programme would be useful to see long-term physiological effects. Wiltshire 2020. Pole work has been identified to have a positive influence on limb kinematics, provided the trot gait of the horse is symmetrical, because any abnormalities or existing asymmetry in load distribution may be exaggerated by the use of trot poles. Clayton et al. 2015. It has also been identified that raised trot poles cause joint flexion to increase further, suggesting that higher poles have more of a significant influence on equine limb biomechanics. Therefore, the use of raised poles is effective for stimulating maximal joint flexions and hoof elevation. Brown et al. 2014. Raised poles require the horse to flex its spine, stretch its legs, and engage its hindquarters to produce impulsion, improving both strength and skill. Karsten-Reiber et al. 2017. Encouraging joint range of motion is an important consideration for any training program. By establishing a correct movement pattern, we are able to reduce the likelihood of injury and maintain good joint health. William, 2020. All of the studies that looked at pole work, both flat and raised poles, have identified a positive influence on limb kinematics, therefore confirming the use of pole work in a training program. Multiple studies have looked at the influence of pole work on biomechanics, and each study has confirmed that pole work produced positive outcomes in relation to biomechanical function. Pole exercises have been proven to significantly alter limb kinematics. Jenkins 2020. However, the outcome is usually positive. Brown et al. 2014 identified that trotting over poles relies almost entirely on joint flexion, proving that there has to be a biomechanical change. Loading of the musculoskeletal tissues when trotting over poles is not significantly greater in comparison to a normal symmetrical trotting gait. Clayton et al. 2015. Joint range of motion is improved through the use of trot pole work as identified by Brown et al. 2014. Further research is required to both support the long-term effect of pole work on equine limb kinematics and also to investigate the effect of pole work under saddle with the influence of a rider on board.